assumed with absolute certainty that I did not understand a single word of what she was saying. I listened carefully as her voice dropped to a conspiratorial hushed whisper. The French language is famously known as the language of love, but right now in her mouth it sounded like a jagged blade being methodically sharpened in the dark. And then I heard it. The first word that made my heart slam violently against my ribs. Tutelle. Guardianship. My mind began to race, spinning out of control, while my body remained frozen in place. Why would my wife be discussing legal guardianship with someone on a phone in the middle of the Canadian wilderness? Before I could even begin to process the sheer magnitude of that betrayal, the second word hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. Asile. Asylum. A psychiatric facility. I did not move a single muscle. I did not let my breathing hitch or my eyelids flutter. But underneath my heavy winter coat, my fists clenched so hard that my fingernails dug painfully into the palms of my hands, almost drawing blood. I lay there in the deceptive warmth of the passenger seat and listened to the woman I had loved, provided for, and trusted with my life laugh lightly. It was a cold, dismissive, and utterly heartless chuckle. Then she said the sentence that will remain branded into my memory until the day I die. She said, "He will not survive the winter in that place. The paperwork is almost done, and then everything is ours. He will not survive the winter in that place." She was talking about me, her husband, the man who had spent 40 grueling years breaking his back in the freezing winds of winter and the scorching heat of summer as a chief structural engineer. I was not a man who had everything handed to him on a silver platter. I built skyscrapers that touched the clouds. I designed massive steel bridges that carried millions of tons of concrete and humanity safely across treacherous waters. I survived 2 major open-heart surgeries, bouncing back each time only to work relentless 80-hour weeks. I did all of that to build a fortune of $6 million. I sacrificed my own health and my own peace of mind so Cynthia would never have to worry about a single bill, so she could live in a sprawling, multi-million-dollar estate in New York, wear the finest designer clothes, and enjoy a life of absolute, uncompromised luxury. I had always planned to spend my twilight years peacefully by her side, enjoying the fruits of a lifetime of grueling labor. But lying there, feigning sleep while the snow continued to fall outside, the brutal truth washed over me. I was not a husband to her anymore. I was an obstacle. A stubborn, aging, breathing obstacle standing between her and my bank accounts. She thought I was just a clueless, failing old man whose mind was slowly turning to mush. She thought I was an easy target. What Cynthia did not know, what she had never bothered to ask in all our decades together, was what I did before I met her. Long before I moved back to New York, before I amassed my wealth and settled down into suburban life, I spent 5 of the most vibrant, intense years of my youth living and working in Paris. I oversaw the structural retrofitting of historic centuries-old bridges across the Seine River. I worked with local construction crews. I ate, slept, breathed, and loved in French. The language was permanently and flawlessly hardwired into my brain. Every single syllable of her treacherous, venomous conversation was crystal clear to me. She was plotting to have me declared mentally incompetent. She was actively planning to lock me away in some forgotten freezing facility across the Canadian border, strip me of my basic human rights, and take every single penny I had bled to build. The sheer level of premeditation, the cold-blooded patience required to execute such a plan terrified me. It meant that every smile, every kiss, every cup of coffee she had handed me over the last few months had been a calculated step toward my destruction. If you are listening to my voice right now, and you have ever discovered that the person sleeping next to you, the person you trusted with your very soul, is actually your worst enemy, please tell me where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to gather your strength to stand up to the people who underestimated your worth and plotted your downfall. I need to know I am not alone in this kind of living nightmare. I swallowed, the bitter taste of bile rising in my throat. I heard the soft electronic beep of the phone disconnecting. I heard the rustle of her heavy wool coat as she casually tossed the device into her expensive designer handbag, a bag I had bought for her last Christmas. I kept my eyes shut. I maintained the slow, rhythmic breathing of a harmless, sleeping fool. Then I felt her delicate hand reach out and gently shake my shoulder. "Richard, darling." "Wake up," she whispered softly. I slowly opened my eyes, blinking away the fake sleep, making sure to look slightly confused and entirely vulnerable. Cynthia was looking down at me, her face glowing with the warmest, most loving, and most terrifying smile I had ever seen. I stretched my arms out slowly, letting out a soft, groggy sigh, as if I were just pulling myself back from a deep and restful sleep. I rubbed my nose, blinking against the harsh white glare of the snow reflecting through the windshield. Cynthia's hand was resting gently on my knee, her thumb rubbing soothing circles into the thick fabric of my winter trousers. It was a gesture she had performed thousands of times over our 30 years of marriage, a gesture that used to make me feel anchored, loved, and safe. Right now, it took every ounce of willpower I possessed not to physically recoil from her touch. It felt like a venomous spider crawling across my skin, leaving a trail of burning betrayal in its wake. I looked at her, painting a sleepy expression across my face. "Did I fall asleep?" I mumbled, keeping my voice gravelly. "I thought I heard you talking to someone. Who was that on the phone, honey?" Cynthia did not flinch. She did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. Her breathing remained perfectly steady, and the warm, adoring smile on her face never wavered. The sheer perfection of her deception was almost mesmerizing. If I had not spent 5 years in Paris, if I did not understand the language she had just used to casually discuss my impending imprisonment, I would have believed her completely. "Just the Canadian realtor, darling," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She reached over and tenderly adjusted the collar of my coat, tucking a stray thread back into place. "It turns out they need some extra paperwork for the cottage. You know how bureaucratic these cross-border property sales can get. But do not worry yourself about it. I am handling everything so my hard-working husband can just relax and enjoy his retirement." She patted my chest gently, right over my heart. The same heart that had endured 2 grueling surgeries. The same heart she was patiently waiting to stop beating forever. "You are too good to me, Cynthia," I replied. My voice was incredibly steady, surprisingly rich with warmth. I even reached out and placed my hand over hers, squeezing it affectionately. I smiled back at her, masking the absolute disgust that was threatening to drown me. Looking deep into her brown eyes, I searched for any sign of guilt, any flicker of remorse for the monstrous betrayal she was orchestrating. There was absolutely nothing. Her eyes were bright, clear, and completely empty of any real empathy. It was in that exact moment that the woman I married ceased to exist. She died right there in the passenger seat of that SUV, replaced by a cold, calculating stranger who saw me as nothing more than a walking bank account with an expiration date. I turned my head to look back out the window, pretending to admire the desolate, snow-covered landscape of the Quebec countryside. My mind was a raging storm of fury and calculation. I wanted to grab the steering wheel and swerve off the road. I wanted to shout in perfect, flawless French and demand to know why she was doing this to me. I wanted to tear the mask off her face and watch the panic set in as she realized I knew everything. But I did not. Because an angry man makes mistakes, and a silent man makes plans. If you found out the woman you shared a bed with for 30 years was planning to lock you in an asylum, in a foreign language, what would be your first move? Scream, confront her? Let me know in the comments. Because my choice was absolute, terrifying silence. Silence is a weapon. In the construction business, you never tear down a load-bearing wall until you know exactly where the pressure is coming from, and until you have built a stronger support structure to take its place. Cynthia had laid a trap, but by keeping my mouth shut, I had just flipped the board. She thought she was the hunter. but she had just handed me the loaded gun. I needed to know the full extent of her plan. I needed to know who she was working with, how far along the paperwork was, and exactly how she intended to strip me of my fortune and my freedom. The rest of the drive to the cottage was an exercise in pure psychological endurance. We pulled up to a rustic, isolated wooden cabin surrounded by towering pines. We walked through the property, Cynthia pointing out the fireplace and the bay windows. I nodded along, praising her excellent taste, all the while knowing this was never meant to be a vacation home. This was meant to be my staging ground before they dragged me away to a facility. I spent the entire afternoon playing the role of the clueless, grateful husband. Every smile I gave her cost me a piece of my soul. Every word of agreement felt like swallowing glass. But I played my part flawlessly. When we finally got back into the car to head toward the border, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the snow. The vehicle felt degrees colder despite the heater blowing steadily. Cynthia settled into the driver's seat and pulled her phone out of her expensive leather handbag. She turned the screen slightly away from me, a movement, but one I caught instantly. For decades, Cynthia's phone passcode had been the year we were married. I knew it, she knew it, and we never had secrets. But as I watched her from the corner of my eye, pretending to adjust my seatbelt, I saw her thumb rapidly tap a new sequence of numbers. 4 different digits, a brand new passcode she had never used before. She locked the screen, slipped the phone into her coat pocket, and put the car in drive, completely unaware that the war had already begun. The drive back to New York was a masterclass in silent warfare. As we crossed the border and the frozen landscape of Quebec slowly melted into the familiar highways of upstate New York, I maintained my facade. But once we were back inside the walls of our sprawling multi-million-dollar estate, the real psychological battle began. Over the next few days, a terrifying new conflict started to emerge, one that made me question my own sanity. I always possessed a razor-sharp mind. You do not spend decades engineering steel structures without a flawless memory and impeccable attention to detail. I could remember the exact tensile strength of a steel beam used on a project 30 years ago. But lately, a strange, suffocating fog had begun to roll into my brain. It was an unnatural, heavy grogginess clinging to me just like a wet blanket. I would walk into my study and suddenly forget why I was there. I would lose my train of thought mid-sentence during dinner. My hands would feel completely numb, and a persistent lethargy made my limbs feel filled with lead. At first, the terrifying thought crossed my aging mind that perhaps Cynthia was right. Perhaps my age was catching up to me and my brilliant mind was genuinely deteriorating. That was the most insidious, dangerous part of gaslighting. But I was an engineer by trade. I began to mentally log these episodes of intense brain fog, searching for a variable. It did not take long to pinpoint the exact time when the confusion always peaked. It was always mid-morning, exactly 1 hour after breakfast, and exactly 1 hour after my daily medication. For the last 5 years, I had taken a standard mild medication for my blood pressure. It was a routine so deeply ingrained that I rarely even thought about it. But over the last 2 months, ever since the discussions about the Canadian cottage had subtly begun, Cynthia had completely taken over this routine. She claimed she was just being a devoted, caring wife. She told me she had read articles about elderly men forgetting their medication, and she could not bear the thought of losing me. Every single morning without fail, she would bring the pill to me. She never left it on the table. She would place it directly into the palm of my hand, hand me a glass of room-temperature water, and stand right there watching intently until I swallowed it. I used to think it was profound love. Now I realized it was the calculated behavior of a prison guard ensuring an inmate took their sedatives. On a crisp Tuesday morning, the tension reached its breaking point. I was sitting at the heavy mahogany dining table reading the morning newspaper, though the words were just blurring together on the page. I needed to know the truth. I needed physical proof. Right on cue, Cynthia walked into the dining room. She was wearing a pristine white silk robe looking exactly like an angel of mercy. In her right hand she held the familiar blue capsule. In her left, a crystal glass of water. She smiled warmly, but her eyes were cold, fixed entirely on my mouth. "Here you go, my love," she cooed softly, placing the pill in my open palm. "Time for your medicine. Let us keep that strong heart of yours beating." I looked down at the small blue capsule resting in the creases of my aged hand. My heart was pounding so violently, I was surprised she could not hear it echoing across the dining room. I brought the pill to my lips. I took a sip of the water. But instead of throwing the pill to the back of my throat, I expertly slid it under my tongue. I swallowed the water loudly. Then I immediately launched into a violent hacking coughing fit. I hunched over the table, my shoulders shaking, pretending the water had gone down the wrong pipe. "Oh my goodness, Richard, are you all right?" she asked, her voice laced with sudden, sharp concern. I reached into my chest pocket and pulled out my cotton handkerchief. I pressed it to my mouth as I continued to cough aggressively. Through the fabric, I used my tongue to push the blue capsule out of my mouth and into the folds of the handkerchief. "I need—" I gasped out, clutching my chest. "I need a napkin. Could you get me a napkin from the kitchen, please?" Cynthia hesitated. I could feel her dark eyes scanning me, searching for any sign of deceit. But my coughing sounded painfully authentic, and my face was turning a convincing shade of red. "Of course, darling, right away," she murmured, finally turning her back to me and walking briskly toward the kitchen archway. The second she was out of sight, I quickly slipped the handkerchief into the deep pocket of my trousers. I wiped my mouth and patiently waited for her to return. When she handed me the napkin, she lingered, her eyes darting to the empty water glass. "Good boy," she whispered, satisfied that her daily task was complete. 10 minutes later, I locked myself inside my master bathroom. I turned on the fan and pulled the damp handkerchief from my pocket. I unfolded the white cotton fabric under the bright, unforgiving light of the bathroom vanity. There, resting in the center, was the little blue capsule. I picked it up with trembling fingers and brought it close to my eyes. I did not need a microscope to see what she had done. The gelatin casing of the pill was not smooth. There was a tiny jagged scratch running down the center of the seam, as if it had been very carefully pried apart with a razor blade and then clumsily pressed right back together. The fine white powder inside was slightly clumped, spilling out of the cracked seam. My blood ran completely cold. She was poisoning me. For several long minutes, I just stood there in the glaring light of my master bathroom, staring at the little blue capsule resting on the white cotton fabric. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train, yet my mind felt clearer than it had in weeks. The fog was lifting, replaced by a cold, sharpened fury. I carefully folded the handkerchief, ensuring the tampered pill was securely wrapped, and slid it into the inner pocket of my tweed jacket. I splashed cold water on my face, practiced my frail, confused expression in the mirror, and unlocked the bathroom door. I found Cynthia in the living room, comfortably curled up on the velvet sofa, sipping a cup of herbal tea while browsing a catalog of expensive winter coats. When she heard my footsteps, she looked up, her face instantly transforming into a mask of sweet concern. "Are you feeling better, darling?" she asked, setting her teacup down. That coughing fit sounded terrible. I gave her a weak, trembling smile and patted my chest slowly. "Much better, my dear," I rasped, making my voice sound a bit thin and tired. "I think I just need some fresh air. The house feels a little stuffy today. I am going to take a slow walk in the park across the street, just to stretch my legs." Cynthia smiled, a triumphant gleam flashing in her dark eyes. She thought the medication was taking effect, making me docile and agreeable. "That sounds like a wonderful idea, Richard. Do you want me to come with you? I can put my coat on." No, I insisted, gently waving a dismissive hand. "You stay here and relax. You do so much for me already. I will just take a short stroll." She did not push it. She watched me slowly put on my wool overcoat and scarf, her eyes following my every deliberately sluggish movement. The moment the heavy oak front door clicked shut behind me, my posture changed. My spine straightened. The frail, shuffling walk vanished. I walked briskly down the driveway, turned the corner out of sight of the house windows, and immediately hailed a passing yellow cab. "Take me to the medical district on the east side," I told the driver, handing him a $50 bill up front. "And please step on it." As the cab wove through the busy New York traffic, my mind raced. I was heading to a private toxicology laboratory, run by an old colleague of mine, a brilliant chemist named Thomas. I had helped Thomas secure the funding for his facility 2 decades ago, and he owed me a favor. More importantly, he was discreet. I needed answers, and I needed them without Cynthia or her hidden accomplices finding any trace of my investigation. No insurance claims, no credit card receipts. I arrived at the sleek glass-fronted building and bypassed the main reception desk, heading straight for the private offices in the back. Thomas was surprised to see me, but the grim, uncompromising look on my face told him this was not a social visit. I pulled the folded handkerchief from my pocket and placed the blue capsule on his pristine stainless steel desk. "I need a complete toxicology breakdown of this pill," I told him, pulling a thick envelope of cash from my coat pocket and dropping it next to the handkerchief. "I need to know exactly what is inside this casing, and I need the results expedited. Right now. Today." Thomas looked at the cash, then at my face. He did not ask any useless questions. He simply nodded, picked up the capsule with a pair of tweezers, and disappeared into the secured testing area. The wait was excruciating. I sat in his private office for 2 hours, staring at the ticking clock on the wall. Every second that passed felt like a lifetime. I thought about the 30 years I had given Cynthia. The vacations in Europe, the jewelry, the endless comfort. I thought about how she had smiled at me over breakfast, knowing she had handed me a loaded weapon. My grief had completely burned away, leaving nothing but a vast, terrifying wasteland of resolve. Finally, the heavy door opened, and Thomas walked back into the office. He was holding a printed lab report, and his face was completely drained of color. He sat down heavily in his chair and pushed the paper across the desk toward me. "Richard," he started, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where did you get this? Just tell me what it is," I demanded, my voice harder than concrete. Thomas sighed, rubbing his forehead. "The outer casing is your standard blood pressure medication, but the powder inside has been completely replaced. It is laced with massive concentrated doses of lorazepam." I stared at him, the clinical name echoing in my mind. "What does that do?" "It is a very potent heavy sedative," Thomas explained grimly. "In standard doses, it is used for severe anxiety. But in the concentrated amounts found inside this capsule, especially for a man your age, the side effects are catastrophic. It causes profound lethargy, loss of motor control, and severe cognitive impairment. It induces severe memory loss, confusion, and hallucinations. If you had been taking this daily, your brain would literally mimic the advanced stages of severe dementia." The clinical words hung in the sterile air of the office, heavy and suffocating. Lethargy, confusion, memory loss, dementia. I looked down at the lab report, the black ink blurring slightly before my eyes as the horrifying truth locked firmly into place. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. The strange brain fog, the sudden clumsiness, the forgotten conversations. It was not old age. It was not my mind failing me. It was her. Cynthia was not just planning to claim I was crazy. She was actively, methodically, chemically engineering my dementia to make the legal guardianship application completely, absolutely bulletproof. I left Thomas standing in his laboratory, the printed toxicology report burning a hole in my inner coat pocket. I stepped back out into the biting chill of the New York afternoon, my breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. The physical cold was nothing compared to the absolute glacial freeze that had taken over my heart. I knew what my wife was doing, but there was still one terrifying, unanswered question echoing in my mind. Who was the person on the other end of that phone call in Quebec? Who was helping her coordinate this monstrous scheme? needed to know who her accomplice was. There was only one person I could think of who stood to benefit from my sudden disappearance. I hailed another cab and gave the driver the address of my son Derek and his tech startup in the financial district. As I watched the city streets blur past the window, my mind drifted back to a time when my family actually felt whole. I remembered buying Derek his very first car when he turned 16. It was a modest, sturdy sedan, but the look of pure joy on his face had made every hour of overtime entirely worth it. Years later, when he came to me with a grand vision for his own technology company, I did not hesitate. I drained a significant portion of my liquid assets, sacrificing my own carefully planned retirement timeline to give him the seed money he needed. I believed in him. I loved him. He was my child. The cab pulled up to a sleek, modern, high-rise building. I paid the fare and walked through the revolving glass doors, taking the elevator up to the 14th floor. When the silver doors slid open, I expected to step into a bustling hub of innovation. Derek always bragged at family dinners about his expanding team, the frantic energy of his developers, and the lucrative contracts he was supposedly securing. But as I stepped onto the polished concrete floor of his office suite, I was greeted by an eerie, hollow silence. The expansive, open-plan workspace was almost entirely empty. Rows of expensive wooden desks sat completely bare, stripped of their computer monitors and personal belongings. The decorative neon sign bearing his company logo was switched off. There was no hum of servers, no ringing telephones, no young programmers aggressively typing away at their keyboards. There was only the sound of my own leather shoes echoing sharply across the empty room. I walked slowly toward the glass-walled executive office at the far end of the floor. Through the smudged glass, I saw my 45-year-old son. Derek was sitting slumped behind his massive desk, staring blankly at a single laptop screen. He looked absolutely terrible. His expensive suit jacket was discarded on the floor, his tie was loosened, and his face was pale and unshaven. Dark, heavy bags hung under his bloodshot eyes, painting a picture of a man who had not slept peacefully in weeks. I pushed the glass door open. It creaked slightly, breaking the dead silence of the room. Derek jumped violently in his leather chair, slamming his laptop shut in a state of sheer panic. When his frantic eyes finally focused on me, the terror on his face did not subside. It simply morphed into a tight, defensive mask. "Dad," he stammered, his voice cracking slightly as he quickly stood up. "What are you doing here? You did not call." "Why are you not at home with Cynthia?" He stumbled around the desk, deliberately blocking my view of his closed laptop. I looked around the desolate office, then back at my sweating, nervous son. "Where is your staff, Derek?" I asked softly, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. He waved a trembling hand dismissively, offering a forced synthetic laugh. "Oh, you know how it is in the tech world. Most of the team is working remotely this week. Just a new agile workflow protocol. Nothing for you to worry your head about." He stepped closer, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. His grip was entirely too tight. "Actually, Dad, I am really glad you are here. We need to talk. Cynthia called me this morning. She is really worried about you." I stared at him, feeling the absolute last shred of my paternal affection wither and die. "Is she?" I murmured. "Yes," Derek continued, his words rushing out in a practiced, urgent torrent. "She told me you had a terrible coughing fit today. She says you have been wandering around the house, forgetting conversations, looking lost. You have been so forgetful lately, Dad. It is dangerous. You really need to listen to Cynthia. You need to let us help you. You should sign over the management of your financial accounts to her just until you feel better. It is the smartest thing to do for the family right now." He was parroting her exact words without a single ounce of shame. Every single calculated syllable he spoke was a perfectly rehearsed line from the very twisted script that Cynthia had specifically written for him. I looked at the dark circles under his panicked eyes. I remembered the frantic whispered phone call in the snowy woods of Quebec. I remembered the crisp, rapid French Cynthia had spoken, and then a devastating memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. When Derek was in college, I had paid for him to spend 2 full years studying abroad in Paris. He was fluent in the language. The pieces of the nightmare finally locked together in my mind, forming a picture so grotesque I could barely breathe. My wife was not working with a random real estate agent or a corrupt lawyer. The person on the phone in Canada was standing right in front of me. My own flesh and blood, my only son, was the ruthless schio-conspirator plotting to lock me away forever. I stared deeply into the bloodshot eyes of my only son, feeling the last remaining fragments of my heart turn into cold, heavy stone. The crushing weight of the betrayal should have brought me to my knees. It should have made me weep right there on the polished concrete floor of his empty startup. But tears did not come. Instead, a profound, chilling clarity washed over my mind. I was no longer a grieving father mourning the loss of his family. I was a structural engineer staring at a severely compromised building, and I knew exactly how to demolish it safely. I managed to summon a weak, trembling smile playing perfectly into the narrative they had constructed. "You might be right, Derek," I whispered, making my voice waver just enough to sound defeated. "I have been so tired lately. Let me go home and rest. We can talk about the paperwork tomorrow." The visible wave of relief that washed over his face made me sick to my stomach. He eagerly walked me to the elevator, his hand resting on my back, in a grotesque imitation of filial affection. When the silver doors closed, severing my view of him, my trembling completely stopped. I stood up straight. The hunt had officially begun. I did not go back to my sprawling estate in the suburbs. Instead, I took a taxi to an old, dimly lit diner on the outskirts of Brooklyn. I slid into a vinyl booth in the very back corner, ordered a black coffee, and waited. 20 minutes later, the bell above the door chimed, and a man slid into the seat directly across from me. His name was Bradley. On paper, he was a certified public accountant. In reality, he was a financial ghost, a ruthless forensic investigator who specialized in tracking stolen assets and dismantling complex corporate fraud. He was the kind of man wealthy individuals hired when they needed to destroy someone quietly and completely. He wore an unremarkable gray suit and carried a battered leather briefcase looking entirely unmemorable. That was his greatest weapon. "Mr. Harrison," Bradley said, his voice smooth and devoid of any unnecessary emotion. "It has been a long time. I was surprised to receive your call." I did not waste any time with pleasantries. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a thick, encrypted flash drive. I slid it across the scratched Formica table. "On this drive, you will find the master access codes to every single family trust, all of my personal banking records, and the foundational financial documents for my son's technology company. I need a comprehensive audit, Bradley." Bradley picked up the drive, his eyes scanning my face with calculated precision. "An audit of your own son, sir? That is a highly unusual request. Are we looking for simple mismanagement, or is there a specific discrepancy you want me to locate?" I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. "I do not care about simple mismanagement. My wife and my son are actively conspiring to declare me mentally incompetent. They are poisoning me with sedatives, and they are planning to lock me in an offshore psychiatric facility to seize my entire estate. I need you to find the motive. I need to know why they are moving so fast, and why my son is suddenly desperate enough to betray his own father." Bradley did not flinch or show any surprise. He simply slipped the flash drive into his pocket and pulled out a small notepad. "Understood. What are the parameters of the investigation?" "There are no parameters," I told him, my voice as hard as the steel beams I used to weld. "I want to know every cent they owe. I want to know every secret they hide. Dig until their bones show Bradley. I want their entire financial lives laid out on a table for me to dissect." He nodded slowly, a faint glimmer of professional respect appearing in his eyes. "I will need unrestricted access to pull credit reports, wire transfer histories, and private equity contracts. It will not be cheap, and it will not be polite. Money is not an issue, I replied, tossing a thick envelope of cash onto the table to cover his immediate retainer. Just find the truth. I left the diner and returned to my house, arriving just as the sun began to set. Cynthia was waiting for me in the foyer, her face a perfect portrait of false worry. I played my part absolutely beautifully. I stumbled slightly as I took off my coat, allowing her to guide me to the living room chair. I drank the warm evening tea she prepared for me, secretly spitting the bitter liquid into a large ceramic potted plant, when she quickly turned around to carefully adjust the heavy velvet window curtains. I went to bed early, pretending to fall into a deep drug-induced slumber, but I absolutely did not sleep a single wink. I lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, waiting. The silence of the house was absolute, broken only by the soft, rhythmic breathing of the woman lying next to me. The woman who wanted me gone. The painful, agonizing hours slowly crawled by in total silence. The digital clock on the nightstand shifted slowly, the glowing red numbers illuminating the dark room. At exactly 2 a.m, my secure burner phone vibrated violently against the wooden surface of the bedside drawer. I carefully slipped out from under the heavy down comforter, my bare feet silent on the thick carpet. I moved quietly into the master bathroom, closed the door tightly, and answered the call. "Bradley," I whispered into the receiver. "What did you find?" The investigator's voice sounded tight, completely stripped of its usual calm professionalism. He took a slow, heavy breath before speaking. "Mr. Harrison, you need to see this right now. Your son isn't just a bad businessman. He's a dead man walking." I did not ask Bradley any questions over the phone. I simply ended the call quietly, dressed in the pitch-black darkness of my bedroom, and slipped out of the house. The streets of New York were completely deserted at that hour, wrapped in a suffocating silence that matched the terrifying stillness in my own chest. I drove myself to the same dimly lit diner we had met at previously. Bradley was already waiting in the back booth. He had a thick manila folder resting on the table in front of him. A single untouched cup of black coffee sat beside it. I slid into the vinyl seat across from him. He did not offer a greeting. He simply opened the folder and pushed a stack of heavily redacted financial documents toward me. "Mr. Harrison, your son is in deep trouble," Bradley began, his voice maintaining its usual flat, clinical tone. "The technology startup you visited earlier today is nothing but a hollow shell. It has been entirely defunct for 8 solid months. His development team walked out last summer after 3 consecutive missed payrolls. His servers were seized by creditors. The office you stood in was literally just a staged set piece. He pays for the lease using the last remaining scraps of his personal credit, purely to maintain the illusion of success for you and his professional network." I stared at the balance sheets. The numbers were staggering. Millions of dollars had been completely vaporized in a series of incredibly reckless, arrogant investment decisions. But that was not the worst part. Bankruptcy was a tragedy, but it was survivable. I looked up at Bradley, sensing there was a much darker layer to this revelation. "Who is he running from?" I asked quietly. Bradley pulled out a separate sheet of paper. It was a wire transfer log, but the recipient names were not corporate entities. They were individuals heavily flagged by federal authorities. 8 months ago, when traditional banks cut him off, your son turned to the shadow market. He borrowed $2.5 million from a highly organized, extremely violent loan shark syndicate operating out of New Jersey. My breath hitched in my throat. $2.5 million. That was not a debt you could simply negotiate your way out of. That was a death sentence. Suddenly, the frantic, terrified look in Derek's bloodshot eyes made perfect sense. The sweat on his brow, the desperate trembling in his voice. He was not just stressed about a failing business. He was terrified for his physical safety. The people he owed money to did not send collection letters. They broke bones. They made people disappear. "But how does my wife fit into this nightmare?" I asked, feeling a cold sweat break out across my forehead. Bradley steepled his fingers, leaning slightly forward. Cynthia discovered his debt 3 months ago. Instead of offering to help him come to you and beg for a bailout, she recognized the perfect golden opportunity she had been patiently waiting for. She offered him a lifeline, but it came with a terrifying price tag. The two of them formed a mutually beneficial, completely ruthless alliance. Bradley tapped a legal document in the file. It was a blank petition for emergency medical guardianship. Cynthia needs your son for this to work flawlessly. As your primary biological relative, if Derek stands in front of a judge and tearfully testifies that his elderly father is suffering from severe aggressive dementia, the court will grant the petition without hesitation. The medical system trusts the unified voice of a devoted wife and a loving son. Together they form an unbreakable legal front. The moment you are declared incompetent and quietly shipped off to that facility in Quebec, Cynthia gains total control of your $6 million estate. I sat back in the booth, the vinyl squeaking softly beneath me. The sheer mechanical evil of their plan was breathtaking. Derek gets $2.5 million transferred directly to his creditors, effectively saving his own life, I murmured, piecing the puzzle together aloud. And in exchange, he legally signs my life away, leaving Cynthia with the remaining $3.5 million, the real estate portfolio, and absolute freedom from her aging husband. Bradley nodded slowly. Exactly. Your son is terrified of the syndicate, and your wife is completely consumed by greed. They are using you as the sacrificial lamb to solve both of their problems. I looked down at my hands. I stared at my calloused skin, remembering every single sacrifice. These were the hands that had built homes, paid for college tuitions, and provided a life of absolute privilege for both of them. I had given Derek his very life, and I had given Cynthia my unwavering loyalty. Now they were calculating the exact exchange rate of my freedom to pay off a gambling debt. I did not feel sorrow anymore. The lingering ghost of my paternal instinct evaporated into the stale diner air. If Derek was willing to trade my sanity and my freedom to save his own skin, he was no longer my son. He was just another parasite. And Cynthia was the architect of my execution. I closed the manila folder. Thank you, Bradley, I said, my voice completely devoid of any tremor or hesitation. Prepare the offshore trust documents. I want everything locked down before the end of the week. Not a single penny stays in my name. Bradley offered a tight, acknowledging nod. I will have the legal team finalize the irrevocable transfer immediately. As I slid out of the booth, my secure phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was a text message from Cynthia. The notification read, "Come home quickly, darling. I have a very special surprise guest arriving for dinner tonight. We simply cannot wait to see you. Do not be late for our special family gathering tonight." I slipped the secure phone back into my pocket and took a deep, steadying breath. The cool night air of Brooklyn did nothing to soothe the burning rage radiating from my chest. I walked to my car, slid into the driver's seat, and drove back to my sprawling estate in the suburbs. As I pulled into the wide, paved driveway, I noticed an unfamiliar black sedan parked near the entrance. The special surprise guest had already arrived. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, gripping the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned completely white. I had to bury my anger. I had to become the frail, confused old man they expected me to be. I practiced a slow, slightly vacant smile in the rearview mirror, let my shoulders slump forward, and stepped out of the vehicle. When I opened the heavy oak front door, the rich aroma of roasted garlic and seared steak filled the foyer. I shuffled slowly into the formal dining room, dragging my feet just enough to make my entrance sound hesitant. Cynthia was standing by the large mahogany table wearing an elegant burgundy dress. Beside her stood a tall, remarkably thin man with graying hair and a sharp, calculating face. He wore a dark tailored suit that looked slightly too expensive for a casual family dinner. "Ah, there he is," Cynthia chimed, her voice echoing with that sickening artificial sweetness. Richard, darling, I am so glad you made it back in time. I want you to meet someone very special. This is Julian Vargas. He is a dear old friend from my Tuesday evening book club. He was in the neighborhood, so I simply had to invite him to stay for dinner. The thin man stepped forward and extended a smooth, manicured hand. It is an absolute pleasure to finally meet you, Richard. Cynthia has told me so many wonderful things about you. I reached out and shook his hand, letting my grip remain incredibly weak and loose. But inside, alarm bells were ringing with deafening volume. Julian Vargas. The name was instantly recognizable. While Bradley was investigating my son, he had also pulled a comprehensive background check on every new contact in Cynthia's phone. Dr. Julian Vargas was not a harmless book club friend. He was a disgraced, highly corrupt psychiatrist. 5 years ago, his medical license had been quietly suspended following a massive scandal involving fraudulent medical diagnoses. He now operated entirely in the shadows, specializing in writing completely fabricated mental incompetence evaluations for wealthy families looking to seize control of contested estates. For the right price, he would declare anyone legally insane. And tonight, I was his assignment. I am very pleased to meet you, Julian. I mumbled, forcing my voice to sound slightly breathless and uncertain. Any friend of my wonderful wife is always welcome in our home. We sat down at the grand dining table. Cynthia served thick cuts of medium-rare steak, pouring generous glasses of expensive red wine. The atmosphere felt incredibly heavy, like the suffocating air just before a violent thunderstorm. Vargas did not waste any time. As soon as we began eating, the casual dinner conversation smoothly transitioned into a calculated, predatory interrogation. This is a truly magnificent home you have built, Richard. Vargas began slicing his steak with methodical precision. Cynthia tells me you were a structural engineer. That requires an incredible amount of mathematical precision and memory. Do you still keep up with your old projects? I took a slow bite of my food, chewing deliberately. Oh, not as much as I used to, I replied, staring blankly at my plate. Sometimes it is hard to keep track of all the details. Vargas offered a sympathetic, patronizing smile. I completely understand. Aging is a difficult process for all of us. The mind naturally begins to slip. For example, can you tell me what day of the week it is today? And perhaps the exact date? The audacity of the question was staggering. He was not even trying to hide his clinical evaluation. I looked at Cynthia, who was watching me with intense, unblinking focus, holding her wineglass perfectly still. It is Tuesday, I stammered intentionally, letting my brow furrow in an exaggerated display of mild confusion. Or maybe Wednesday. The days just seem to blend together lately when you do not have to wake up for work anymore. Vargas nodded slowly, his sharp eyes burning into me. Of course. That is completely normal. But managing an estate like yours must be quite a heavy burden. Finances can become so overwhelmingly complicated as we get older. Do you still manage all the banking passwords and investment portfolios yourself, Richard? Or do you write them down somewhere to help you remember? I felt a sharp surge of disgust. He was probing for my financial vulnerabilities, trying to determine if I was lucid enough to maintain control over my own money, or if I had conveniently written down my master passwords for Cynthia to find. Oh, the bank handles most of that. I lied softly, letting my hands tremble slightly as I reached for my water glass. I think I have a little black notebook in my study. But my memory is not what it used to be. Sometimes I cannot even remember the name of my own first dog. That last sentence was bait, and Vargas took it immediately. Childhood memories are usually the last things to fade, he noted, leaning closer across the table. Tell me about your childhood, Richard. Do you remember the street you grew up on? Do you remember the name of your elementary school? He was meticulously gathering the exact verbal ammunition he needed to securely sign those guardianship papers and condemn me to a frozen nightmare in Canada. I sat there chewing my steak, playing the helpless victim to absolute perfection, while they both smiled greedily at my performance before their eyes. I looked across the table at Derek, who had quietly joined us just before the main course was served. My son sat there picking at his roasted vegetables, actively avoiding my gaze. He was the final piece of their twisted little tribunal. Vargas was the executioner, Cynthia was the architect, and Derek was the necessary blood relative required to make my living burial completely legal. I knew exactly what they needed from me tonight. They needed a performance. They needed undeniable proof of my rapid cognitive decline to justify the emergency medical petition. So instead of fighting back, instead of throwing my steak knife across the room and demanding they all get out of my house, I leaned completely into their trap. I reached out for the basket of warm bread positioned near the center of the table. I deliberately made my right hand shake. Not just a slight nervous tremor, but a violent, uncontrolled spasm. As I pulled my arm back, I intentionally clipped the side of my crystal wine glass. The heavy glass tipped over with a sharp clink, sending a dark crimson wave of expensive Cabernet Sauvignon flooding across the pristine white linen tablecloth. The red stain spread rapidly, soaking into the delicate fabric like a freshly opened wound. "Oh dear," I stammered, letting my voice crack with genuine-sounding panic. "I am so sorry. I did not see it there. My hands are just so clumsy lately." Cynthia gasped, but the sound was entirely theatrical. "Oh, Richard, do not worry about it," she cooed quickly, standing up and tossing a thick cloth napkin over the spreading red puddle. "It is just a little spilled wine. We can easily have the housekeeper replace the tablecloth tomorrow. You just sit still and relax." I kept my eyes fixed on my lap, letting my chin tremble. I forced a single tear to well up in the corner of my eye. It was a tear of sheer humiliation, though the emotion fueling it was pure, unadulterated rage. I glanced up through my eyelashes and saw Dr. Vargas watching me with a look of immense professional satisfaction. He was not looking at a tragic accident caused by a failing elderly man. He was looking at a completed checklist. Motor skill degradation. Check. Emotional volatility. Check. Loss of spatial awareness. Check. It took every single ounce of pride I had left in my body to sit there and play the fool. I was a man who used to command hundreds of hardened steelworkers. I had stood on steel beams suspended 50 stories above the concrete pavement, shouting orders over the deafening roar of heavy construction machinery. I had built majestic structures that would outlast everyone sitting in this room. My mind was sharp enough to calculate load-bearing weights and wind resistance formulas without ever touching a calculator. Yet here I was, slouching in my own dining room, intentionally drooling slightly from the corner of my mouth, allowing these parasites to feed their monumental egos at the expense of my dignity. It was a brutal, agonizing psychological torture. But I knew that in order to destroy them completely, I had to let them believe they had already won the war. I wiped my mouth with the back of my trembling hand and turned my attention toward my son. Derek was staring at the ruined tablecloth, his face pale and drawn. I decided to give Dr. Vargas the final undeniable piece of evidence he needed to seal their fate. "Max," I mumbled, looking directly into my son's eyes, with a vacant, wandering stare. "Max, could you please pass me a new napkin?" I made a terrible mess. The entire dining room went absolutely dead silent. The tension in the air was so thick you could physically choke on it. Max was not my son. Max was the name of our golden retriever who had passed away over a decade ago. Derek flinched violently, as if I had just reached across the table and struck him across the face. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked at Cynthia in absolute horror, and then he looked at Dr. Vargas. The corrupt psychiatrist simply offered a slow, tragic nod, silently confirming the severity of my fabricated delusion. "Dad." Derek whispered, his voice trembling with a chaotic mixture of guilt and terror. "It is me. It is Derek." I blinked rapidly, looking around the room in a state of exaggerated, helpless confusion. Derek. Of course it is, Derek. I am sorry, son. I just... I am just so incredibly tired. My head feels so cloudy tonight. Cynthia stepped in, playing the role of the exhausted, suffering caregiver flawlessly. I think it is time for you to go upstairs and rest, my love, she said, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. You have had a very long day, and all this excitement is just too much for you. Julian and Derek can finish their dinner. I will come up and check on you in a little while. I nodded submissively, allowing her to carefully help me out of my heavy wooden chair. I shuffled out of the dining room, dragging my feet heavily across the polished hardwood floor. I slowly climbed the grand staircase, gripping the mahogany railing tightly, making sure they heard my slow, laboring footsteps ascending to the second floor. But the moment I reached the top landing, completely out of their line of sight, the frail old man vanished entirely. My posture straightened instantly, my breathing leveled out. I moved with absolute silent precision. I crept down the carpeted hallway that overlooked the grand foyer and quietly positioned myself near the central air conditioning vent, which carried the acoustics from the lower level perfectly. I waited in the cold darkness, listening to the muffled sounds of the dinner concluding. About 20 minutes later, I heard the scrape of chairs pushing back against the dining room floor. Heavy footsteps moved from the dining room into the front hallway, stopping right below my hidden position. It was Derek and Dr. Vargas. I held my breath, pressing my ear closer to the metal grate of the vent. Is that enough to sign the papers? Derek whispered. His voice was frantic, laced with the desperate urgency of a man drowning in syndicate debt. Did you get everything you need from him tonight? I heard the smooth, unmistakable rustle of a heavy paper envelope changing hands. It was the distinct sound of a massive cash bribe being delivered in the shadows. Dr. Vargas chuckled softly, a dry, completely hollow sound that echoed up through the vent and chilled me to my very core. More than enough, the psychiatrist replied smoothly. His cognitive function is severely compromised. I will have the guardianship certificate ready by Friday. Friday. That single word hung in the cold, dusty air of the air conditioning vent, like a swinging guillotine. It was currently Tuesday night. That meant I had less than 72 hours before my own son and my treacherous wife possessed a legally binding document capable of stripping away my human rights and locking me in a Canadian nightmare. I silently backed away from the vent, retreated to my Sutter bedroom, and lay down next to the woman who was currently dreaming about my demise. The next morning, I woke up early. I pulled a dusty canvas duffel bag from the back of my closet and began stuffing it with thick wool sweaters and heavy boots. When Cynthia walked in, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "What are you doing, Richard?" she asked, eyeing the bag with a hint of suspicion. I gave her my best foolish, absent-minded smile. "I am going fishing, my dear. Do you not remember? I told you about the 3-day senior fishing retreat upstate with the boys from the lodge. We have had this planned for months." Cynthia blinked mentally, calculating how this unexpected trip affected her timeline. I could see the sudden relief wash over her face. With me out of the house, she and Derek would have complete freedom to finalize the legal paperwork and coordinate with the border smugglers without having to sneak around. "Oh, of course, darling," she said smoothly, stepping forward to help me pack. I must have forgotten. That sounds like a wonderful idea. Getting out into nature will be so good for your nerves. Just make sure you take your medicine. She handed me a freshly prepared pill bottle. I smiled, tucked it into my bag, and promised I would not miss a single dose. I kissed her cheek, feeling absolutely nothing, and walked out to my car. I drove precisely 2 miles down the road before pulling into an abandoned strip mall parking lot. A sleek black town car with tinted windows was already idling by the curb, arranged flawlessly by Bradley. I abandoned my vehicle, climbed into the back seat of the town car, and instructed the driver to take me to the private airfield on the edge of the city. An hour later, I was strapped into the leather seat of a chartered private jet, watching the New York skyline disappear beneath the clouds. My destination was not a rustic fishing cabin upstate. My destination was Baltimore, Maryland. Specifically, the premier neurological and psychiatric research division of Johns Hopkins Hospital. If Dr. Vargas was going to write a fraudulent paper, claiming my brain was rotting away, I was going to secure an ironclad, indisputable medical dossier from the top diagnostic medical board in the entire country to prove otherwise. I checked into the private high-security VIP wing of the hospital under a legally established alias. The medical team waiting for me consisted of 3 renowned neurologists and 2 senior psychiatrists. I did not give them a sob story. I sat down in the sterile examination room, looked the lead doctor dead in the eye, and told him I needed the most brutal, exhaustive cognitive evaluation humanly possible. I told them my freedom depended on their absolute thoroughness. For the next 12 hours, I was subjected to a grueling gauntlet of medical and psychological testing. They placed me inside loud, claustrophobic machines for high-resolution brain scans to check for tissue degradation. They drew vial after vial of my blood to establish a baseline of my physical health and screen for toxins. The psychiatrists interrogated me for hours, throwing complex memory recall tests, advanced spatial reasoning puzzles, and high-stress situational logic problems at me at a relentless pace. I did not falter. I leaned into the discipline that had allowed me to design structurally flawless bridges for 4 decades. I solved their puzzles. I recited intricate mathematical formulas from my youth. I dismantled their psychological traps with the sharp, calculated precision of a man fighting for his very life. It was exhausting, draining every ounce of my physical stamina, but my mind burned with a brilliant, white-hot clarity. I was not a confused old man. I was a structural engineer preparing to detonate a building. The testing carried on continuously from Wednesday afternoon through Thursday evening. They evaluated my reaction times, my emotional stability, my short-term and long-term memory retention, and my ability to make complex financial decisions under duress. Every single test was recorded, monitored, and analyzed by the best medical minds in the country. They were looking for any sign of dementia, any symptom of cognitive decline, but they found absolutely nothing. They only found a man pushed to the absolute brink, functioning at the highest possible level of human endurance. When the testing finally concluded late Thursday afternoon, I sat in the lead doctor's office, my muscles aching from the tension. The sterile white walls of the clinic felt suffocating. I leaned across his large desk, clasping my hands tightly together. "I need the certified dossier right now," I told him, gripping the arms of my chair. "I need the official board signatures declaring my absolute mental competence." The doctor adjusted his glasses, looking at me with a mixture of professional respect and deep, lingering concern. "You performed exceptionally well, Mr. Harrison," he said softly, looking down at his preliminary notes. "Your cognitive function is remarkable for a man of any age, let alone yours. You possess the mental acuity of a 50-year-old, but the comprehensive toxicology blood work and the necessary notarized signatures from the entire medical board take time to process. They will not be finalized until tomorrow morning." My stomach plummeted into an icy abyss. Tomorrow morning was Friday. The exact day Dr. Vargas was delivering the fraudulent papers to Cynthia. The clock was ticking, and I was running out of time to arm my final trap. I needed those results now. I looked at the lead doctor with a gaze so intense it could have melted the sterile steel instruments resting on his counter. "I understand the administrative protocols of this hospital." I told him, keeping my voice incredibly steady, "But I am telling you that my life is currently ticking down on a very literal clock. If those notarized signatures are not physically in my hands by Thursday night, the clinical brilliance of your medical board will be entirely useless to me." The doctor swallowed hard, clearly taken aback by the sheer gravity of my statement. He promised he would personally walk the paperwork through the hospital legal department the moment the toxicology panels cleared the laboratory. I returned to my private hospital suite and spent the longest, most agonizing night of my entire life staring at the ceiling. Sleep was an absolute impossibility. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my wife smiling as she handed me a poisoned blue pill, and I saw my son trembling as he sold my freedom to the highest bidder. Thursday dragged on with a slow, agonizing cruelty. I paced the length of the room, counting the hours, the minutes, and the seconds. Finally, at exactly 7 on Thursday evening, a sharp knock echoed on the heavy wooden door of my suite. The lead doctor stepped into the room. He was holding a thick, pristine white envelope bearing the official embossed seal of the Johns Hopkins Medical Board. He handed it to me with a solemn nod. "It is completely finished, Mr. Harrison," he said quietly. "Your blood work came back completely clean of any naturally occurring cognitive diseases, though we did note the residual traces of the heavy sedatives you mentioned. But more importantly, the psychiatric and neurological evaluations have been signed, stamped and legally notarized by all 5 senior board members." I opened the envelope with trembling hands and pulled out the thick stack of premium paper. There, printed in undeniable black ink, was the absolute salvation of my life. The final diagnostic summary was incredibly clear. The board unanimously declared that I possessed 0 markers for dementia, Alzheimer's disease, or any form of cognitive impairment. In fact, they officially noted that my mental acuity, problem-solving skills, and memory retention were actively functioning at the level of a healthy, highly educated 50-year-old man. I traced my fingers over the raised notary seals. These beautiful, undeniable stamps of legal authority meant that Dr. Vargas and his fraudulent evaluations were completely neutralized. With this dossier in my possession, I was legally untouchable. No judge in the country would ever grant an emergency guardianship petition against me. I thanked the doctor, packed my canvas duffel bag, and immediately headed for the private airfield. The chartered jet carried me back to New York under the cover of a starless, pitch-black night. As I looked out the small cabin window at the sprawling grid of city lights below, I felt a profound, dangerous calm settle over my entire body. The fear was completely gone. The sorrow of losing my family had burned down into cold, hardened ash. I was returning home not as a victim, but as an executioner. When you are preparing to destroy the people who sleep under your roof, you do not use emotion. You use paper, ink, and the law. Hit the like button if you agree it is time for my revenge. I needed them to pay for every single lie. I landed in New York just past midnight and instructed my driver to park 3 blocks away from my estate. I walked the rest of the way, my footsteps completely silent against the cold pavement. I bypassed the main entrance and used my old master key to unlock the heavy side door leading directly into the kitchen. The house was entirely pitch dark and suffocatingly silent. Cynthia and Derek undoubtedly believed I was still sitting around a campfire upstate, blissfully unaware of the trap closing around my neck. I moved through the shadowy corridors of my own home like a ghost, completely bypassing the grand staircase that led up to the master bedroom. Instead, I headed straight for the small, elegant sunroom, where Cynthia spent most of her mornings drinking tea and reading. If she was plotting a cross-border kidnapping, she would not be careless enough to leave paper trails lying around. She was a woman anchored to her digital devices. I slipped into the sunroom and closed the heavy glass doors behind me. The moonlight filtering through the windows illuminated exactly what I was looking for. Resting gracefully on the glass coffee table was her sleek silver iPad. She had recently changed her passcodes, rendering my previous knowledge useless. But Bradley, the forensic accountant, had anticipated this exact obstacle. Before I left, he handed me a highly sophisticated piece of hardware. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the flat rectangular spy device. It was a military-grade data cloner designed to bypass biometric locks and siphon the entire hard drive of any connected tablet or phone within minutes. I carefully plugged the short connecting cable directly into the charging port of the tablet. The small device instantly hummed to life, a single green light blinking rhythmically in the dark room. A tiny digital progress bar illuminated on the screen of the cloner. 10. 20%. I stood there in the chilling silence of the sunroom, watching the numbers climb rapidly. 50%. I was draining every single text message, every encrypted email, and every hidden photograph she possessed. 80%. I knew the truth about the money, and I knew the truth about the fraudulent medical records. 100%. The green light turned solid, but as I safely unplugged the device and retreated into the shadows of my private study to review the newly cloned files, I realized I had not yet uncovered her darkest, most lethal secret. I carried the spy device into the heavy silence of my private study, locking the solid oak door firmly behind me. I sat down at my massive mahogany desk, the only light in the room coming from the cold blue glow of my computer monitor. I plugged the data cloner into my secure desktop tower and began to systematically sift through the immense mountain of stolen digital files. Cynthia was meticulous, but she possessed the distinct technological arrogance of someone who believed she was always the smartest person in the room. She had organized her hidden life into neatly labeled folders, hiding them behind layers of biometric security she assumed were entirely impenetrable. I bypassed them all in seconds. I scrolled past the mundane records of her daily life, the online shopping receipts, and the harmless emails from her book club, digging much deeper into the encrypted messaging applications she had buried deep within the operating system. What I found there went far beyond a simple plan to legally seize my fortune. It was a blueprint for a quiet, untraceable murder. I opened a conversation thread tied to an unregistered prepaid international phone number. The messages were entirely in French, the same rapid cold language she had used in the car. The contact name was simply listed as the driver. As I read the translated text on my screen, the blood completely froze in my veins. The charming rustic cottage in Quebec we had visited was just a staging area, a temporary distraction she had used to lull me into a false sense of security. The actual destination they had prepared for me was located 40 miles further north, completely off the grid. It was an abandoned, dilapidated hunting shack, hidden deep within the treacherous snow-covered Canadian wilderness. It had no electricity, no running water, and absolutely no heating system. It was a wooden tomb surrounded by miles of deadly freezing terrain. The driver was not a real estate agent or a corrupt lawyer. He was a professional border smuggler, a ruthless human trafficker who specialized in moving illegal cargo through unmonitored logging roads straight across the northern border. The details of their master plan were spelled out with a terrifying clinical precision. The emergency guardianship petition from Dr. Vargas was never meant to be filed in a legitimate court of law. It was merely a backup insurance policy, a piece of paper they could show the authorities if I somehow managed to fight back and caused a scene before they could easily transport me. The real plan, the one they were executing, this coming Saturday, was infinitely more sinister. Cynthia had agreed to pay the smuggler a staggering $50,000 in untraceable cash. According to the messages, the timeline was incredibly rigid. On Saturday morning, under the guise of packing for another peaceful weekend getaway, Cynthia was going to prepare a special thermos of herbal tea for the long drive. But this tea would not be laced with the usual low dose of lorazepam. She was going to dissolve a massive lethal quantity of the heavy sedative directly into the liquid. Her exact words in the text message were, "Make sure he is completely unresponsive. He needs to be in a deep, unbreakable coma before we even load him into the back of the vehicle." Once I was rendered completely unconscious, Derek was scheduled to drive the SUV up to a predetermined drop point near the Canadian border. They would hand my comatose body over to the smuggler, who would drag me through the thick snow and throw me carelessly into the pitch-black freezing basement of that abandoned hunting shack. They would lock the heavy wooden door from the outside and simply walk away, leaving me there to wake up in absolute icy darkness. I would have no winter clothing, no fresh food, and absolutely no way to call for help. The freezing temperatures of the remote Quebec winter would naturally handle the rest. I would slowly freeze to death or starve completely alone in the frozen wilderness. Meanwhile, back in the United States, Cynthia and Derek would wait precisely 48 hours before driving together to a local police station in upstate New York. Cynthia would put on the greatest performance of her life, weeping hysterically in front of the authorities, falsely claiming her confused, dementia-ridden husband had simply wandered off into the dense woods during a nature walk and miraculously vanished without a trace. They would organize extensive search parties. They would print missing person flyers. Derek would confidently stand in front of local news cameras begging for the safe return of his beloved father. But the search dogs would never find my scent, because I would be rotting in a locked basement in another country. After a few short months, I would be legally declared dead, and they would easily inherit my entire $6 million estate without ever having to answer a single question in probate court. I sat quietly in my dark study, staring intently at the glowing monitor screen, completely paralyzed by the sheer, unadulterated evil of the woman I had peacefully slept next to for 3 long decades. She did not just want my money. She wanted me permanently erased from the face of the earth in the most agonizing, terrifying way imaginable. Every memory we had built together was now stained with her profound betrayal. I slowly closed the heavy laptop, letting the spacious study plunge back into absolute suffocating darkness. I did not shed a single tear. The trusting man who loved Cynthia was completely dead and gone. On Friday morning, I would gather my legal team and finally begin the relentless process to bleed the greedy beast entirely dry. The trap was fully set, and they had absolutely no idea what was coming. Their perfect crime was about to become their ultimate, inescapable destruction, and I would personally orchestrate every single devastating moment of it. Friday morning broke with a cold, pale light filtering through the heavy curtains of my study. I had not slept a single second. I sat at my desk as the dawn slowly illuminated the room, feeling a strange sense of absolute tranquility. The agonizing weight of betrayal that had suffocated me for the past week had entirely vanished, replaced by a singular, razor-sharp focus. Today was the day I completely dismantled their future. Today was the day I bled the beast entirely dry. I quietly walked upstairs to the master bathroom and showered, letting the scalding water wash away the lingering chill of the night. I shaved with meticulous care. I put on one of my best tailored charcoal suits, buttoning the crisp white shirt with steady hands. For the first time in weeks, I did not practice my frail posture. I stood tall, my shoulders squared, looking at the reflection of the man who had built a fortune from the ground up. Before leaving the bedroom, I glanced at Cynthia, who was still sound asleep under the thick duvet. I wondered what she was dreaming about. Perhaps she was dreaming of expensive vacations and new designer clothes funded by my frozen corpse. I turned away without a shred of pity and walked downstairs. I left a brief, hastily scrawled note on the kitchen counter, claiming I was going into town to pick up some special fishing gear for my imaginary weekend trip. Then I stepped out into the crisp morning air and got into the waiting town car Bradley had arranged. The drive into Manhattan was swift and silent. We arrived at a towering glass skyscraper in the financial district, home to one of the most ruthless and elite wealth management law firms in the city. Bradley was waiting for me in a sprawling glass-walled conference room on the 50th floor. He was accompanied by 3 senior estate attorneys, all dressed in immaculate suits, their faces tight with professional gravity. They had the cloned digital files I forwarded them overnight. They knew exactly what my family was planning to do to me tomorrow morning, and because they knew the stakes, they had worked through the night to prepare the ultimate financial weapon. I took a seat at the head of the massive mahogany table. The lead attorney, a stern man named Harrison, slid a thick stack of legal documents enclosed in a leather binder toward me. He opened the cover to reveal pages upon pages of dense, complex financial legislation. "We have prepared the documents exactly as you requested," Richard the attorney said, his voice echoing slightly in the large room. "But before you sign this, it is my absolute ethical duty to ensure you completely understand the sheer magnitude of what you are about to do. This is an irrevocable trust. The key word is irrevocable." I looked down at the crisp white paper, then back up at the attorney. "Explain it to me plainly," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "If you sign these papers today," the attorney continued, leaning forward on the table, You are legally severing yourself from your entire fortune. Every single penny of your $6 million liquid estate will be instantly transferred into a heavily protected trust dedicated solely to the Regional Pediatric Cardiac Hospital. The trust will be managed by an independent board of directors. You will receive a very modest fixed monthly stipend to cover your basic living expenses, but you will never again have access to the principal amount. You cannot change your mind next week. You cannot reverse the transfer. Even if you begged the court, the money is locked away forever. You will be, for all practical purposes, walking out of this building today as a man with almost zero personal net worth. He paused, letting the heavy reality of his words settle over the room. If your wife and son succeed in securing a guardianship order tomorrow, he added quietly, they will be given the keys to an empty vault. They will inherit absolutely nothing. But neither will you. I listened to his warning, feeling the steady rhythmic beating of my own heart. Decades ago, my life was saved by 2 major cardiac surgeries. Now the wealth I had sacrificed my health to build was going to save the hearts of thousands of children. I pictured Derek drowning in his syndicate debt, desperately waiting for a payout that would never arrive. I pictured Cynthia dreaming of a luxurious life as a grieving widow, suddenly realizing she was entirely broke. "Hand me the pen," I said. The attorney nodded slowly and handed me a heavy fountain pen. I did not hesitate. I did not let my hand tremble. I signed my name on the first page, the sharp scratch of the nib loud in the quiet room. I signed the second page. I initialed the complex transfer authorizations and the sweeping asset forfeiture clauses. With every stroke of the pen, I felt a massive, suffocating weight lifting off my shoulders. I was not losing my fortune. I was buying my absolute freedom. Within 20 minutes, the process was completely finalized. The attorneys immediately executed the wire transfers. I sat there and watched a digital monitor on the wall as my massive bank accounts, the joint investment portfolios, and the lucrative mutual funds all rapidly drained down to a balance of absolute zero. The beast was officially dead. The money was gone, secured behind an impenetrable fortress of legal armor. Bradley closed his briefcase with a sharp click and looked at me with a rare, faint smile. "The liquid assets are secure," he confirmed softly. "Your wife and son are currently bankrupt on paper. But we still have one massive, glaring vulnerability left to address." I nodded, looking out the massive window at the sprawling city below. The cash was safe, but the physical assets still remained. I owned a sprawling multi-million-dollar estate in upstate New York. It was the house I had promised to leave Derek. It was the house Cynthia believed she would comfortably rule from once I was rotting in the Canadian snow. It was Friday morning, and the lethal tea was scheduled to be poured on Saturday. I had less than 24 hours left, and I needed to figure out how to completely dispose of my own castle right from under their greedy feet before the sun came up tomorrow. The solution to my real estate problem was already waiting for me in a securely encrypted file folder resting on the expansive mahogany conference table. Harrison, the incredibly astute lead attorney, had fully anticipated my urgent need to completely liquidate my massive physical assets without triggering any immediate alarms or public property transfer notices. If Cynthia accidentally intercepted a county registry notification, her carefully laid plans would instantly accelerate. Harrison pulled out a fresh, thick stack of legal documents, the premium paper feeling crisp and intimidating under the bright fluorescent lights of the boardroom. This was the master deed transfer for my home, the sprawling multi-million-dollar estate in upstate New York that I had meticulously designed and built entirely from the ground up. The property was to be sold immediately at a strictly fair market value to an anonymous limited liability company. This anonymous corporate entity was, of course, entirely owned and tightly controlled by the newly established Pediatric Hospital Trust. The funds to purchase the home would be drawn directly from the trust, and the physical house itself would be permanently absorbed into their extensive endowment portfolio. From a strictly legal standpoint, The transaction was entirely bulletproof. It was a private, unlisted corporate buyout that would leave absolutely no visible trace for anyone looking to challenge my financial standing. But successfully selling the massive house was only the first delicate part of the legal maneuver. If Cynthia suddenly noticed moving trucks pulling into the driveway, or if she received a formal eviction notice in the mail, she would instantly realize I was onto her lethal scheme. Therefore, Harrison calmly presented me with a secondary, highly unconventional document. It was a standard, legally binding residential lease agreement. I was officially renting my own beloved home back from the anonymous trust. I would pay a fixed monthly fee to the corporation just to continue living in the exact same master bedroom where my treacherous wife was currently sleeping. I took the heavy gold fountain pen and deliberately signed the property deed over, legally stripping myself of the very roof over my head. Then, without a single moment of hesitation, I signed the tenant lease agreement. In a matter of mere minutes, I transformed from being the absolute undisputed king of my own castle to a mere temporary occupant, a lowly renter in the magnificent halls I had built with my own two hands. I left the towering glass skyscraper in Manhattan just as the afternoon traffic began to clog the city streets. The ride back to upstate New York felt remarkably peaceful, my mind clear of the anxiety that had plagued me for days. When the town car finally pulled into the long winding driveway of my estate, the late afternoon sun was casting long golden shadows across the meticulously manicured lawns. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked slowly up the wide stone steps leading to the grand entrance. I unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped into the expansive foyer. The house was dead quiet. Cynthia had left a brief note on the polished entryway table stating she was out running some final errands in town to prepare for our supposed relaxing trip tomorrow. I was completely alone in the massive house. I walked slowly through the silent, echoing corridors of the home. I ran my fingertips gently along the dark mahogany-paneled walls of the central hallway. I knew every single inch of this magnificent structure. I knew the exact depth of the foundation holding it up. I vividly remembered the cold, rainy autumn weeks I spent arguing with stubborn contractors over the quality of the imported marble flooring. I remembered meticulously inspecting the heavy load, bearing beams hidden behind the pristine drywall, ensuring that the entire structure would stand incredibly strong against the harshest, most brutal winter storms. I built this massive home to be an impenetrable fortress of comfort, luxury, and absolute safety for my family. I built it to be a lasting, beautiful legacy for my only son, a physical, enduring manifestation of my unconditional love and my lifelong, grueling labor. Now the very walls felt deeply tainted, heavily infected by the silent, poisonous greed of the two people living inside them. Giving up this beautiful house was a profound, deeply emotional sacrifice that I had never anticipated making. It truly felt like tearing a piece of my own soul directly out of my chest. But as I stood alone in the center of the grand, formal living room, looking up at the high vaulted ceiling and the massive crystal chandelier catching the fading amber sunlight, I felt absolutely no regret whatsoever. Sometimes a king has to willingly burn his own kingdom to the ground in order to trap and slaughter the vicious traitors hiding inside the castle walls. The expensive stone and the rare wood meant absolutely nothing if the people breathing the air within them were actively plotting my cold-blooded murder. I was willingly reducing my entire kingdom to invisible ashes so that Cynthia and Derek would inherit nothing but the cold, unforgiving reality of their own horrific actions. As the dark evening slowly approached, the heavy front door quietly clicked open, but it was not Cynthia returning from her shopping errands. It was Bradley. He moved with his usual silent, unremarkable efficiency, stepping into the dim foyer and briefly surveying the grand, sweeping architecture of the house. He walked deliberately into my private study, where I was standing silently by the large bay window, watching the dark shadows lengthen across the expansive back gardens. Bradley opened his battered leather briefcase and pulled out a single thin manila envelope. He did not offer any dramatic, unnecessary statements. He simply walked over to the heavy mahogany desk and laid the brown envelope down squarely in the center of the green leather writing pad. I turned away from the glass window and walked slowly over to the desk. I opened the unsealed envelope and slid out the freshly printed official banking documents. They were the final certified statements from every single financial institution where I had previously held an account. The joint checking accounts I shared with my wife, the high-yield savings accounts, the massive diversified investment portfolios, the lucrative private equity funds. Every single page displayed the exact same devastating numbers in bold, unforgiving black ink: $0 and 0 cents. The massive wire transfer to the irrevocable pediatric trust was completely finalized. The secret sale of the estate to the anonymous corporate entity had successfully cleared the county registry without raising any flags. The money was securely locked away forever, far beyond the greedy reach of any corrupt psychiatrist, any murderous wife, or any desperate, debt-ridden son. Bradley stood quietly near the open doorway of the study, his hands clasped neatly and professionally in front of his gray suit. He looked directly at me, a rare flicker of genuine, profound respect cutting through his usual stoic, emotionless demeanor. "It is done, Richard," he said, his voice remarkably smooth and incredibly calm in the quiet, shadowy room. "You are practically broke on paper." I thanked Bradley and watched him slip out the back door, melting into the night. I was a man with no money and no home, yet I had never felt more powerful. I went upstairs, slipped into bed beside Cynthia, and closed my eyes. The sun rose on Saturday morning, carrying with it a heavy, suffocating atmosphere that settled over the entire estate. Today was the day of our supposed romantic getaway to the freezing Canadian wilderness. Today was the day they planned to drug me into a coma, steal my life, and leave me to rot in an abandoned hunting shack. I woke up early, moving with a deliberate, measured slowness. I did not dress in the heavy winter wool or the thick flannel shirts one would expect for a cabin retreat. Instead, I carefully put on a sharp, dark navy suit. I chose a crisp white shirt, a conservative silk tie, and polished my leather shoes until they gleamed. I was not dressing for a vacation. I was dressing for a corporate execution. When I walked downstairs into the kitchen, the air was thick with a frantic, malicious excitement. Cynthia was bustling around the marble countertops, aggressively packing small travel bags with snacks and supplies. Her movements were sharp and highly erratic. Her eyes were bright, dilated with the greedy anticipation of a predator about to secure its kill. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw my attire, a flash of genuine confusion crossing her perfectly made-up face. She looked at my polished shoes, then up to my silk tie. "Richard, darling." "What on earth are you wearing?" she asked, her voice tight with forced sweetness. "We are driving up to a rustic cabin in Quebec. You cannot wear a tailored suit into the woods. You will freeze." I offered her a gentle, completely vacant smile. "Oh, you know me, Cynthia. I just wanted to look nice for our special trip. I can always change when we get there. My mind is just a little scattered this morning." She accepted the excuse immediately, her lips curling into a satisfied smirk. She turned her attention back to the stove where a silver kettle was beginning to whistle loudly. "I am making your special morning tea," she announced, pouring the boiling water into a delicate porcelain cup. "I added extra honey and a special herbal blend to help you relax during the long drive. You have been so tense lately, and I just want my handsome husband to sleep peacefully on the way up." I knew exactly what was in that special herbal blend. It was the massive lethal dose of lorazepam she had discussed with the border smuggler. It was the chemical weapon designed to shut down my nervous system and render me entirely comatose before we even crossed the state line. She carefully carried the steaming cup to the kitchen island and set it down in front of me, her eyes locked intensely onto my face. "Drink up, my love," she urged softly. "It is best while it is hot." I reached out with a trembling hand, allowing my fingers to brush against the warm porcelain. "It smells wonderful," I murmured, "but let it steep for just another minute. I need to go to my study and grab my reading glasses." I would hate to forget them. I turned and shuffled away before she could protest, leaving the poisoned tea sitting on the counter. The cat and mouse game had officially begun. For the next hour, I wandered aimlessly through the spacious rooms of the house, deliberately finding ridiculous excuses to delay the inevitable. I reorganized the books on my shelf. I meticulously folded a throw blanket in the living room. Every time Cynthia approached me with the steaming cup of tea, her patience wearing noticeably thinner, I managed to slip away with another confused, absent-minded apology. The tension in the house was escalating to a dangerous boiling point. The air felt incredibly heavy, charged with a dark electric anxiety. Then the sound of heavy tires crunching on the gravel driveway shattered the morning quiet. Derek had arrived. I watched through the front window as my son stepped out of his large black SUV. He looked frantic, his movements jerky and rushed. He practically sprinted up the front stone steps and burst through the heavy oak door without even knocking. "Are we ready?" he demanded, his eyes darting frantically between Cynthia and me. "We need to leave right now. We have a very tight schedule to keep today." Cynthia glared at me, her mask of sweet affection completely slipping to reveal the cold, hard frustration underneath. "Your father is being difficult, Derek. He refuses to drink his morning tea, and he is wearing a business suit to a hunting cabin." Derek turned his bloodshot eyes toward me, stepping heavily into the foyer. The desperate, hunted look of a man drowning in syndicate debt was radiating from every single pore of his body. He walked over to the kitchen island, picked up the porcelain teacup, and marched directly toward me. He stopped mere inches from my face, his tall frame physically blocking my path to the front door. "Dad, drink the tea and sign this travel consent form so we can hit the road." I stood there in the grand foyer of the home I had built, surrounded by the two people I had loved more than anything in the world. The physical intimidation was absolutely palpable. Derek towered over me, holding the poisoned porcelain teacup in one hand and a thick stack of folded legal documents in the other. His chest was heaving with anxious, shallow breaths. He was no longer the little boy I had patiently taught to ride a bicycle, nor the ambitious young man I had proudly sent off to college. He was a desperate, cornered animal, entirely willing to sacrifice his own father's life to escape the violent consequences of his own terrible financial choices. Behind him, Cynthia stepped forward, her movements smooth and calculated, like a venomous snake preparing to strike its prey. She glided across the polished hardwood floor and gently placed her hand on my shoulder, physically guiding me toward the heavy leather armchair sitting in the corner of the room. I allowed myself to be moved without a fight. I dragged my feet across the carpet, letting my knees buckle slightly, playing the role of the defeated, exhausted old man right up to the very last possible second. I sank deeply into the soft leather cushions, letting out a long, ragged sigh of manufactured surrender. Cynthia stood on my left side, resting her perfectly manicured hand on the arm of the chair. Derek stood directly in front of me on my right side, effectively boxing me in. There was absolutely no avenue for physical escape, which was exactly how they wanted it. Derek set the teacup down on the small wooden side table next to me. The bitter chemical smell of the concentrated lorazepam wafted up into my nostrils, mingling sickeningly with the sweet scent of the honey she had heavily poured in to mask the poison. Then Derek unfolded the paperwork. He did not hand it to me to read. He simply placed the thick stack of papers directly onto my lap, making absolutely sure the signature line on the final page was perfectly exposed. He pulled an expensive silver pen from his suit jacket pocket and thrust it aggressively toward my chest. "It is just a standard travel consent form, Dad." Derek lied smoothly, though his voice was betraying a subtle, undeniable tremor of pure panic. "You know how the Border Patrol can be with elderly travelers. They just need to know you are crossing into Canada willingly, and that Cynthia has the medical authority to make healthcare decisions for you if you get sick during the trip. Just sign your name right there on the bottom line." I slowly reached out with a trembling hand and took the silver pen from his tight grasp. I looked down at the documents resting heavily on my lap. I did not need to put on my reading glasses to see exactly what they were. The bold black text printed at the very top of the page was completely unmistakable. It did not say anything about travel consent or Canadian Border Patrol regulations. It read in absolute terrifying legal clarity: durable power of attorney and absolute surrender of medical guardianship. And right there, stamped heavily in the bottom corner of the final page, was the fraudulent official medical seal of Dr. Julian Vargas. This was the kill shot. This was the exact piece of paper that would legally transfer my $6 million estate directly into Cynthia's greedy hands the very moment I was locked in that freezing Canadian basement. They had meticulously orchestrated this entire morning to force my signature under intense duress, ensuring the document was fully executed before the heavy sedatives completely shut down my brain and rendered me unconscious. I sat perfectly still, holding the pen hovering just a single inch above the crisp white paper. The silence in the room was absolute, deafening, and incredibly heavy. I could hear the rapid, anxious breathing of my son standing over me. I could feel the intense, burning stare of my wife boring into the side of my head. They were holding their breath, waiting desperately for the final triumphant conclusion to their monstrous, unthinkable conspiracy. "Just sign it," Richard, Cynthia whispered. Her voice had dropped its fake, sugary sweetness entirely. It was cold, incredibly sharp, and dripping with poisonous authority. "Just sign the paper. It is for your own good. We are going to take very good care of you." I looked at the sharp tip of the silver pen. I looked at the dark ink waiting to spill onto the page and sign my entire freedom away forever. I thought about the desolate, snow-covered woods of Quebec. I thought about the violent smuggler waiting patiently at the border, ready to toss my unconscious body into a lightless freezing room to die alone. I thought about the sheer, unadulterated cruelty required to look a loyal husband and a devoted father directly in the eyes and actively lead him to his own brutal execution. The tension in the room was stretched so incredibly thin, it threatened to snap the very fabric of reality. Derek stepped 1 inch closer, his large shadow falling completely over my face. He subtly shifted his weight, his tense posture silently threatening physical violence if I refused to cooperate with their demands. "Dad," he demanded, his tone dropping into a dangerous, commanding growl. "Do not make this harder than it needs to be. Drink the tea and sign the paper, now." I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs completely. The time for hiding was officially over. The time for playing the weak, confused victim had completely expired. I gripped the silver pen tightly in my right hand, feeling the solid, heavy metal pressing against my fingers. I lowered my hand. I pressed the tip of the pen firmly to the paper. I pressed the tip of the pen firmly to the paper. The metal nib dug into the crisp white surface, threatening to pierce right through it. Derek leaned in closer, a hungry, desperate anticipation radiating from his entire body. He was waiting for the ink to flow. He was waiting for his massive debts to be erased by the stroke of my hand. Cynthia held her breath, her eyes locked onto my trembling fingers, silently celebrating her imminent, flawless victory. But the ink never flowed. Instead of dragging the pen across the dotted line to sign away my life, my sanity, and my freedom, I tightened my grip. I wrapped my thick, calloused fingers around the polished silver barrel of the expensive pen. With a sudden, incredibly violent twist of my wrists, I snapped the thick metal pen completely in half. The sharp, loud crack echoed through the grand foyer like a gunshot. A thick spray of dark blue ink exploded outward violently, splattering across the fraudulent guardianship documents and staining the front of Derek's pristine white dress shirt. Derek gasped instinctively, stumbling backward, his hands flying up to his ruined clothing. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted, his voice cracking with a sudden mixture of confusion and intense anger. "You are ruining the legal paperwork." I did not answer him. I did not offer a single trembling apology. Instead, I placed my hands flat on the solid armrests of the heavy leather chair, and I slowly stood up. The fragile, hunched, and severely confused old man they had been cruelly tormenting for weeks instantly evaporated into the thin morning air. I straightened my spine, pulling my broad shoulders back, rising to my full imposing height. I am a tall man, and standing perfectly straight, I easily towered over my terrified son. The fake, trembling weakness in my knees was completely gone. The vacant, cloudy stare in my eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, penetrating glare that felt like absolute freezing steel. I looked down at the small wooden side table holding the delicate porcelain teacup, which was filled to the brim with the heavy lethal dose of lorazepam. Without breaking eye contact with my son, I raised my polished leather shoe and kicked the table as hard as I possibly could. The solid wood splintered loudly. The table crashed violently to the hardwood floor. The porcelain cup shattered into 100 jagged pieces, sending the warm, poisoned, honey-scented tea splashing directly onto Cynthia's expensive designer shoes. Cynthia let out a sharp, terrified shriek, jumping backward clumsily to avoid the spreading puddle of drugged liquid. She looked up at me, her dark eyes wide with absolute unadulterated shock. The sweet, patronizing mask she had worn so flawlessly for the past few months completely melted off her face, leaving behind nothing but raw, naked panic. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps attempting to spin another desperate web of lies, or to ask me if my aging mind was playing cruel tricks on me again. But I did not give her the chance to utter a single deceptive syllable. I took a slow, highly deliberate step toward her, closing the distance between us, until I was standing entirely within her personal space. I looked dead into her wide, calculating eyes, piercing right through her treacherous soul. When I finally spoke, my voice was not thin, raspy, or weak. It was incredibly deep, highly resonant, and overflowing with absolute terrifying authority. And I did not speak to my wife in English. I spoke with the flawless, perfectly accented pronunciation of a young, vibrant man who had spent 5 incredible years living and working on the bustling streets of Paris. Tu pensais vraiment qu'un ingénieur qui a construit des ponts à Paris ne comprendrait pas le mot tutelle, Cynthia? I paused, letting the beautiful, deadly language wash over her horrified face before translating it into English with a low, menacing whisper. Did you really think an engineer who built bridges in Paris would not understand the word guardianship, Cynthia? The words hung heavily in the charged air of the grand foyer, lethal and completely undeniable. Cynthia was holding a crystal glass of sparkling water in her left hand, likely preparing to toast her imminent financial victory. The very moment the perfect, flawless French syllables left my lips, her fingers went completely numb. The heavy crystal glass slipped right from her trembling grasp and hit the hardwood floor, exploding into a glittering shower of sharp shards. The sharp, violent crashing sound punctuated the absolute suffocating silence of the room. She stood entirely paralyzed, staring at me as if I had just risen directly from the dead to drag her into hell. All the color instantly drained from her perfectly contoured face, leaving her looking like a hollow, terrified ghost. She understood exactly what my French words meant. She realized in that one single devastating moment that I had heard every single syllable of her secretive, venomous phone call in the freezing, isolated woods of Quebec. She realized that I knew absolutely everything about the international border smuggler, the abandoned hunting shack, and the deadly frozen tomb she had so carefully prepared for me. Beside her, Derek turned completely ghost white. His jaw dropped open, and his eyes darted frantically between his trembling mother and my unyielding face. He took another desperate step backward, his legs shaking uncontrollably under the crushing weight of sudden reality. The sheer magnitude of their complete and utter failure was crashing down upon them both right now. I stood there watching their arrogant, greedy world shatter into a million irreparable pieces. The dark nightmare was finally completely over. I looked at the shattered glass on the floor, then at the spilled tea soaking into the wood. Every single trace of their power was completely gone. The hunted old man was dead, and the man who stood in his place was ready to deliver the final crushing blow. Cynthia opened her mouth again, her lips trembling as she desperately searched for a lie to save herself. But I raised my hand, silencing her with a single sharp gesture. I did not want to hear another word falling from her mouth. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored navy suit jacket and pulled out a thick, pristine white envelope bearing the embossed seal of the Johns Hopkins Medical Board. I tossed it directly onto her lap, letting it land heavily against her silk dress. I watched her stare down at the official document, as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. That is a certified, legally notarized neurological and psychiatric evaluation from the top medical diagnostic board in the country, I told her, my voice echoing powerfully in the silent foyer. I spent 3 agonizing days this week taking every complex cognitive test known to modern medicine. The brilliant doctors unanimously declared that my brain is actively functioning at the exact same level as a healthy 50-year-old man. Dr. Julian Vargas and his blatantly fraudulent guardianship papers are now completely worthless. If you ever try to present that forged garbage to a presiding judge, my elite legal team will have both of you indicted for severe medical fraud and criminal conspiracy before you can step out of the courtroom. Cynthia continued to stare at the heavy envelope resting on her lap, her breathing growing increasingly shallow and erratic. She looked trapped, paralyzed by the sheer crushing weight of her own rapidly collapsing scheme. I slowly turned my undivided attention away from her trembling figure and focused entirely on my son. Derek was leaning heavily against the edge of the kitchen island, clutching his chest tightly, as if experiencing a massive heart attack. I reached into my warm coat pocket once more and extracted a secondary, much thinner manila envelope. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him and threw the printed pages directly into his chest. The loose papers scattered out of the folder, fluttering down gracefully to the polished hardwood floor around his shoes. "Pick them up, Derek," I commanded coldly. "Look closely at the laboratory results printed on those pages. That is a comprehensive toxicology report, sourced directly from a secure private chemical testing facility. They systematically tested the special blood pressure medication your stepmother lovingly handed to me every single morning. They found massive, highly concentrated doses of lorazepam meticulously packed inside the tampered gelatin capsules. She was actively poisoning me to chemically simulate the tragic symptoms of advanced dementia, and you stood by and watched her do it. You were willing to let her fry my brain just so you could legally sign me away into a freezing basement in Canada." Derek stared down at the scattered laboratory reports on the floor, his bloodshot eyes widening in absolute horror. He knew he was finally caught. He knew the physical evidence lying at his feet was completely insurmountable. He began to shake violently, his sweaty hands pulling frantically at his dark hair in a pathetic display of crushing despair. But I was nowhere near finished destroying their lives. The medical clearance and the toxicology reports were just the preliminary tactical strikes. It was now time to deploy the final financial devastation. I reached into the breast pocket of my suit one last time and pulled out a heavy stack of recently certified bank statements. These were the exact documents my forensic accountant, Bradley, had personally delivered to me the previous night. I walked over to the shattered remains of the wooden side table and dropped the heavy stack of papers right into the center of the tea-soaked mess. I looked deeply into my son's terrified eyes and delivered the fatal blow without a single ounce of hesitation. "You wanted my money to pay off your mob debts, Derek." I paused, letting the terrifying mention of the violent criminal syndicate hang heavily in the quiet air. "Well, it is gone. The house is sold. The accounts are empty. You are fighting over a corpse that has no gold." Derek gasped loudly, practically choking on his own shallow breath. He stumbled forward clumsily, desperately falling to his knees to snatch the ruined bank statements from the floor. He flipped frantically through the wet pages, his panicked eyes scanning the bold numbers. $0, 0 cents. Every joint account and investment portfolio was drained. I transferred every penny of my estate into an irrevocable pediatric charity trust, I explained, my voice completely devoid of pity. Even I cannot reverse the massive transfer. The money is securely locked away forever, serving a medical purpose. And this magnificent estate you are standing in, I sold it yesterday to an anonymous corporate entity. I am nothing but a humble tenant holding a residential lease. You have nothing left to steal from me. Your inheritance is instantly reduced to worthless dust. The devastating reality crashed down upon Derek like a massive tidal wave of terror. He dropped the bank statements, his hands shaking so violently he could barely keep himself propped up. Without my $6 million to pay off the ruthless loan shark syndicate, he knew he was officially a dead man. The violent criminals he owed money to would not care about his failed business schemes or forged documents. They only cared about extracting their missing $2.5 million, and they would eagerly collect their payment in blood. A primal, suffocating panic completely overtook him. He let out a raw, guttural scream of absolute desperation. His eyes rolled back with sheer madness, and his survival instincts kicked into a blind, animalistic overdrive. He looked at me, his own loving father, not with remorse but with the rabid hatred of a trapped beast facing his imminent slaughter. He scrambled to his feet, his muscles tensing with explosive energy. With a terrifying roar, Derek lunged violently across the room directly at my throat. Derek flew across the space between us, his fingers curled into claws, aiming directly for my throat. The sheer primal fury in his bloodshot eyes was the terrifying culmination of his absolute failure. He was fully prepared to kill me right there on the hardwood floor to salvage his ruined existence, but he never managed to lay a single finger on my suit. Less than a second before his heavy body could crash into mine, the massive oak front doors burst open with a deafening crash. The heavy wood slammed violently against the interior walls. Bradley stepped over the threshold with his usual chilling composure. Immediately behind him, moving with rapid tactical precision, were 4 heavily armed state police officers and 2 federal agents wearing dark windbreakers. The sudden invasion instantly shattered the suffocating tension. "Police, stay exactly where you are," the lead officer bellowed, carrying undeniable authority. Derek was caught mid-stride. The sudden command short-circuited his violent momentum. Before he could attempt to pivot, 2 armored officers tackled him directly to the ground. The physical impact was brutal. Derek hit the polished hardwood floor with a sickening thud, the breath knocked completely out of his lungs. An officer drove a heavy knee sharply into his lower back, pinning him securely against the wooden planks while swiftly twisting his arms behind him. The metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs, ratcheting tightly around his wrists, echoed through the foyer, a sound of inescapable finality. I stood perfectly still, looking down at my only son as he squirmed helplessly under the crushing weight of the officers. His cheek was pressed hard against the floor, right next to the puddle of spilled poisoned tea and ruined bank statements. "Did you really think I would leave anything to chance, Derek?" I asked, my voice cutting clearly through the chaotic noise. "I knew the moment you realized the money was gone, you would resort to violence. You are predictable." Bradley walked slowly across the foyer, stepping over the shattered crystal glass, and stood respectfully by my side, holding a thick legal dossier. I looked over to Cynthia, who was backed into the corner of the kitchen archway, trembling violently. "I did not just hire a forensic accountant to track your hidden debts," I explained, making sure every word landed with devastating precision. "I also hired him to clone your digital devices. Thursday night, I downloaded every encrypted text message from your secret tablet. I read your entire conversation with the border smuggler. I know about the abandoned hunting shack in the freezing woods of Quebec. I know about the massive dose of lorazepam you planned for today." Cynthia gasped, her hands flying up to cover her mouth in sheer terror. "I did not hand those cloned messages over to a simple local judge." I continued, pointing a steady finger directly at her pale face. "I handed them directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You are not being arrested for simple elder abuse or financial fraud. The federal agents standing in my house right now are charging both of you with criminal conspiracy to commit murder across international lines. You planned to kidnap an American citizen, smuggle him across the border, and leave him to freeze to death. That is a federal crime carrying an exceptionally lengthy prison sentence. The crushing weight of the federal charges finally broke Cynthia's fragile reality. Her sophisticated facade completely shattered. She looked at the federal agents advancing toward her and immediately resorted to the only weapon she had left. She began to scream. It was a piercing shriek of manufactured agony. She threw her hands up, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. "You cannot listen to him," she wailed, her voice cracking with desperate emotion. "He is completely insane. He is a sick, delusional old man suffering from severe dementia. He is having a violent hallucination right now. He broke his own teacup and started screaming at us. Please, you have to help me. He is completely out of his mind." She looked pleadingly at the lead federal agent, expecting her performance as the terrified, abused wife to halt the arrest. She expected the authorities to comfort her and call an ambulance. The federal agent did not even blink. His expression remained entirely carved from stone. He possessed the certified medical dossier, the private toxicology report, and the complete transcript of her international smuggling conspiracy. Her pathetic lies were useless against a mountain of verified, irrefutable evidence. "Ma'am, turn around and place your hands firmly behind your back," the agent commanded, completely devoid of sympathy. Cynthia froze, her fake tears suddenly stopping, as she realized her performance was failing miserably. "No, you do not understand," she stammered frantically, backing away until her silk dress pressed against the marble counter. "I am his wife. I take care of him." The agent stepped forward, grabbed her wrists with uncompromising force, and swiftly spun her around. Cynthia let out a genuine scream of panic as her arms were wrenched behind her back. The second pair of cold steel handcuffs clicked aggressively into place, locking her securely. The beautiful woman who planned to rule my empire was now just a restrained criminal. "You have the right to remain silent," the agent began, his voice droning out the devastating Miranda warning. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." I stood tall and watched the absolute destruction of my betrayers. The foyer of the estate I had built with my own hands was now the staging ground for their complete demise. Derek was sobbing uncontrollably on the floor, his face soaked in poisoned tea and pathetic tears. Cynthia was thrashing wildly against the firm grip of the federal agents, her designer dress wrinkling her perfectly styled hair, falling into a chaotic mess around her terrified face. The law had arrived, stripping away their power and replacing it with the reality of a prison cell. The federal agents hauled Cynthia to her feet, ignoring her frantic, pathetic sobs as they began to march her toward the wide-open front doors. I watched the woman I had shared 3 decades of my life with being led away in disgrace, her designer shoes stepping awkwardly over the shattered crystal and the spilled tea she had prepared for my demise. As she crossed the threshold, the heavy reality of the syndicate debt finally crashed over my son with full, uncompromising force. The heavily armored federal officers hoisted Derek up by his shaking arms, his knees scraping incredibly painfully against the cold, polished hardwood floor of the grand entrance. He was no longer trying to fight them. His entire body went completely limp with pure, unadulterated terror. He twisted his neck, straining against the firm grip of the armed police, his tear-soaked face turning desperately toward me. The artificial bravado he had worn just minutes ago was entirely gone, replaced by the broken, cowardly panic of a man staring directly into the abyss. "Dad," he screamed, his voice shattering into a raw, guttural sob that echoed violently off the high mahogany walls. "Dad, you have to help me. You cannot let them take me away. The people I owe money to, the syndicate, they are going to find out I failed. They do not care that I am in federal custody. They have people on the inside. They will kill me, Dad. Please, I am your only biological son. I am begging you. Please save me now. Please, Dad." His desperate pleas bounced off the cold, hard walls of my heart, without leaving a single dent. A week ago, those tears would have broken me. A week ago, I would have sacrificed everything I owned to protect my boy from harm. but the man standing before him was no longer the blind, loving father he had so easily manipulated. I slowly walked over to the antique wooden coat rack standing near the entryway. I lifted my heavy wool overcoat and slipped my arms into the sleeves with calm, measured precision. I reached up and took my dark gray fedora from the brass hook, settling it firmly onto my head. I turned back to look at Derek one